The wind howled through the towering pines, bending their ancient trunks as sheets of rain pounded the earth. Deep in the heart of the wilderness, where civilization felt like a distant memory, Margaret Calloway tightened her wool shawl around her frail shoulders. The storm had come fast, too fast for a woman of her age to make it back to the warmth of her cabin. But she wasn't worried about herself. Something else had caught her attention. A faint, pitiful cry rose above the roaring wind, barely audible, but enough to send a chill down her spine. Margaret paused, narrowing her eyes against the rain, scanning the twisted underbrush beyond the trees. Then she saw it, a tiny, drenched figure huddled at the base of a fallen log, shivering violently. A bear cub. Margaret hesitated. She knew the risks of interfering with nature, but no mother bear would abandon her young willingly. Had the storm separated them? Had something worse happened? The cub's weak whimpers tugged at something deep in her chest, something that overrode all logic. Gingerly, she stepped forward, her boots sinking into the mud. The cub barely reacted, its strength nearly spent. Margaret knelt down, her gnarled hands trembling slightly as she reached out. "You're all alone, aren't you?" she murmured. As the storm raged on, she made her decision. Carefully, she wrapped the tiny creature in her coat and cradled it against her chest. She'd nursed wounded creatures before, birds with broken wings, stray dogs, even an injured deer once, but never something as wild and dangerous as this. She had no idea that the choice she made that night would change everything. And months later, the truth about the cub would leave her breathless. Margaret Calloway had always believed in the untamed laws of nature. Predators hunted, prey fled, and wild creatures remained wild. But in the months following the storm, as she raised the orphan cub in the quiet solitude of her forest cabin, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. The cub, which she had named Theo, grew quickly. His once frail body became strong, his dark eyes sharp and inquisitive. At first, Margaret had expected him to remain wary of her, to display the instincts of his kind, to snarl, to resist, to eventually wander back into the wild. But Theo was different. He followed her everywhere, not in the way a lost creature clings to its caretaker, but with a sense of intent, a kind of gentle awareness that unsettled Margaret. It wasn't fear or dependency. It was something else. One evening, as Margaret sat by the fire knitting, she felt a presence beside her. Looking down, she found Theo watching the movement of her hands with eerie fascination. Then, to her astonishment, he reached out with one massive paw and, with careful precision, touched the ball of yarn. He didn't claw at it like a playful cub might. He merely observed, studied. The next day, as Margaret carried a bundle of firewood from the shed, she nearly dropped it in shock. Theo was beside her, carrying his own small pile of sticks in his mouth. Margaret laughed nervously. "What are you doing, boy?" He didn't react like a pet seeking approval. He simply set the sticks down neatly beside hers and waited. It was a fluke, she told herself. A trick of the mind. But then it happened again, and again. He fetched her dropped gloves without chewing them. He nudged her toward the porch when a storm was approaching, long before she could hear the distant rumble of thunder. And then the most unthinkable thing happened. One morning, as Margaret wandered through the woods checking her old animal traps, set only to mark wildlife movement, never to harm, she heard a distressed cry. Rushing toward the source, she found a young rabbit ensnared, its tiny body quivering in fear. Before she could reach down to release it, Theo stepped forward. Margaret froze. A bear cub, even one raised by human hands, should have instincts too powerful to suppress. But Theo didn't bite. He didn't swat. He carefully unhooked the mechanism of the trap with his claws and then, stepping back, watched as the rabbit bolted into the underbrush. Margaret's breath hitched. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. Bears were apex predators. Opportunistic omnivores, certainly, but they did not possess the intelligence or the inclination to release prey from a trap. This wasn't survival. This was something else. Compassion. Margaret knelt beside Theo, her heart pounding. He turned to her, tilting his head slightly, as though waiting for her reaction. "What are you, Theo?" she whispered. The cub simply blinked, then leaned against her side, the warmth of his thick fur pressing into her like an answer she wasn't ready to accept. But deep down, Margaret knew this bear was no ordinary animal. And whatever he was, the world wasn't ready for him. Margaret sat on the worn wooden steps of her cabin, staring at Theo as he padded quietly across the clearing. The morning mist curled around his dark fur, catching into soft light like threads of silver. She had seen many things in her long life: harsh winters, the silent passing of seasons, the way nature both nurtured and devoured its own. But nothing had prepared her for this. She sipped her tea, the warmth doing little to quell the unease settling in her chest. Was it unease? Or was it awe? Theo was different. She had known that since the night she rescued him, but in those early days, she assumed it was simply because he was young, because he was alone, because she had taken him in. But cubs grew wild. They fought, they learned to hunt, they became what they were meant to be. Yet Theo was growing into something else entirely. Margaret had spent her life observing animals, learning from them. She understood the silent language of the forest, the cautious stillness before a predator struck, the instinctive flinch of prey, the way everything moved according to a code older than time itself. But Theo defied that code. He was not just a bear. He was something more. She watched as he approached the pile of wood she had been gathering, his large paws barely making a sound against the damp earth. He lowered his head, nudging one of the fallen branches before carefully picking it up. Then, without hesitation, he carried it over to the stack beside her porch and placed it down, as neatly as a man would. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had spent hours questioning this behavior. Was it mere mimicry? Some strange byproduct of being raised by a human? But deep down, she knew this wasn't just imitation. Theo understood, not just in the way that animals sometimes learn through repetition, but in a way that suggested a deeper awareness, an intentionality. He recognized kindness. He reciprocated, and that terrified her. She ran a trembling hand through her silver-streaked hair. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. She had taken him in with the expectation that one day he would leave, that the call of the wild would override whatever bond they had formed. That was nature's way. But Theo was rewriting the rules, and Margaret wasn't sure she was ready for the consequences. One evening, as the fire crackled inside the cabin, she found herself speaking aloud, as if saying the words might somehow make sense of them. "You aren't supposed to be like this, boy," she murmured, glancing at Theo where he lay near the hearth, his great body curled comfortably like a domestic animal. His ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't stir. Margaret set her cup down, staring at the way the firelight danced across his thick fur. "You should be wild. You should be chasing down deer, fighting for territory. You shouldn't—" She hesitated. "You shouldn't understand me the way you do." Theo let out a low, steady breath, his eyes barely open. But there was something in his expression that sent a shiver through her. It was a look not of confusion, not of simple animal curiosity, but of knowing. It was a look that made her feel small, like she was the one being studied, and that frightened her more than anything else. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of what she had discovered pressed against Margaret like an invisible force. She tried to dismiss it, tried to tell herself that she was imagining things, that she was reading too much into Theo's actions. But then the incident with the wolves happened. She had been out in the woods, gathering herbs, when she heard the low, warning growls. A pack of wolves, lean and hungry, stood between her and the safety of her cabin. Margaret's breath hitched. She knew better than to run, prey ran, and she had no illusions about her place in the food chain. Then, like a shadow moving through the trees, Theo appeared. But he did not charge. He did not roar or bare his fangs as any wild bear might have. Instead, he stepped forward with measured, deliberate movements. The wolves hesitated. Margaret could see their confusion. This was their land. They had strength in numbers. A bear, especially a young one, should have been an easy challenger. But something in Theo's stance, in his presence, made them falter. And then, in a moment Margaret would never forget, Theo did the unthinkable. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in something that almost looked like understanding. A silent communication passed between him and the pack leader, something ancient and unknowable. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the wolves turned and disappeared into the forest. Margaret collapsed to her knees. No predator behaved like that. No bear had ever done what Theo had just done. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heartbeat hammering wildly. Whatever Theo was, he wasn't just a bear anymore, and the world wasn't ready for him. Winter arrived with a quiet vengeance. Snow blanketed the earth in thick, unbroken drifts, and the river, once alive with the hum of rushing water, had frozen into a silent expanse of glass. The world was still, hushed beneath the weight of the season. Inside the cabin, Margaret sat by the fire, staring into the flickering glow. Theo lay beside her, his massive form radiating warmth like a living furnace. He had grown strong, his once gangly frame now filled out with muscle and thick fur. And yet, he still remained by her side. She knew he should have left by now. Every instinct told her that Theo should be nestled in some remote den, lulled into hibernation by the cold. He should have followed the pull of his kind, seeking the solitude of deep winter sleep. But he hadn't. Instead, he stayed. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting. But for what? One evening, as she sat by the window, watching the snow fall in heavy, lazy flakes, she heard it, a distant, mournful howl. It wasn't a wolf, nor was it the call of any animal she recognized. It was deeper, older, a sound that resonated in her bones. Theo lifted his head. Margaret felt her breath hitch as she watched him rise, his movements slow, deliberate. He turned to her then, those deep, knowing eyes locking onto hers. And in that moment, she understood. He'd been waiting for this. Theo stepped toward the door, pressing a heavy paw against the wooden frame. He turned back one last time, and for the first time in Margaret's long, solitary life, she felt something pass between them, an understanding that needed no words. He was leaving, not because she wasn't enough, not because instinct finally pulled him away, but because he had always belonged to something greater. With a deep, shuddering breath, Margaret pushed herself up and walked to the door. Her hands, aged and worn by time, trembled as she unlatched it and pulled it open. A rush of cold air swept inside, and in the distance, beneath the canopy of a moonlit sky, shadows moved. Shapes emerged from the trees, bears. Not just one or two, but a gathering unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. Large ones, small ones, some that moved with the careful grace of age, others with the reckless energy of youth. And in the center of them all, a presence that stole her breath. A bear unlike any she had ever seen, towering, with fur as pale as the snow itself, eyes dark as the night sky. Theo stepped forward, and the great bear lifted its head. They did not growl. They did not fight. They simply stood together in silence, an unspoken greeting passing between them. And then, Theo turned back to Margaret one last time. A lump rose in her throat, and she forced herself to smile. "Go on, then," she whispered. Theo let out a low rumble, a sound filled not with sorrow, but something that felt like gratitude. And then, with one last look, he stepped into the night, vanishing into the gathering of his kind. Margaret stood in the doorway long after they had gone, the snow swirling around her, her heart heavy yet light all at once. She had always believed that nature was ruled by survival, by instinct alone, that the laws of the wild were written in hunger and fear. But Theo had shown her something different. He had shown her that nature was more than just survival. It was connection, understanding, even love. And as she stepped back into the warmth of her cabin, she knew one thing with certainty. She would never see the world the same way again. Months passed, and with the arrival of spring, the world outside Margaret's cabin awakened once more. The snow receded, giving way to streams of melting ice and the first green shoots pushing through the thawed earth. Life continued as it always had, yet for Margaret, nothing felt the same. She had spent decades studying wildlife, documenting patterns, behaviors, and instincts that had, for generations, been considered unshakable truths. Predators acted on impulse, on hunger, on survival. Animals were creatures of habit, driven solely by necessity. There was no room for choice, for emotion. At least that was what she had been taught. But Theo had proved otherwise. Margaret couldn't ignore what she had witnessed. A bear had shown empathy, intelligence, and something even deeper, an awareness that transcended instinct. And if one bear could do this, how many others had been overlooked? For the first time in her long career, Margaret questioned the limits of science itself. She began writing. Her hands, still steady despite her years, filled notebook after notebook with observations, memories, and questions. She sent letters to colleagues, cautiously presenting her findings, knowing full well how the scientific community viewed unverified claims. At first, there was skepticism. A bear displaying empathy? Choosing cooperation over conflict? It defied established principles of evolutionary biology. Some dismissed her as an aging naturalist romanticizing her experiences. Others suggested she had unknowingly influenced Theo's behavior through domestication. But Margaret knew better, and she wasn't alone. Reports began surfacing. Unusual animal behaviors documented in remote areas. Accounts of wolves fostering orphan pups of rival packs, elephants performing what could only be described as mourning rituals, even dolphins protecting injured members of different species. Margaret's experience with Theo was no longer just an anomaly. It was part of a larger pattern, one science had overlooked for far too long. Soon, her work gained traction. Scientists and researchers reached out, not to dismiss her, but to collaborate. Conservation groups took notice, advocating for new ethical considerations in wildlife management. If animals were capable of emotional depth, of conscious decision-making beyond survival, then humanity's responsibility toward them had to evolve as well. More than once, Margaret found herself invited to speak at conferences, her once isolated voice now carrying weight in discussions of animal cognition and conservation ethics. Yet, despite the growing attention, she never sought recognition. For Margaret, the true transformation was not in the scientific community. It was within herself. She had spent a lifetime believing she understood the natural world, that she had seen all its wonders, unraveled its mysteries. But Theo had taught her the most profound lesson of all. She had always thought of herself as the caretaker, the observer. But in truth, she had been the student. And somewhere, out there in the vast wilderness, Theo roamed, no longer just a bear, but a bridge between two worlds. A silent reminder that the line between human and animal was thinner than anyone had ever dared to believe. And Margaret knew she would spend the rest of her days making sure the world never forgot it. Years passed, but Margaret never stopped telling Theo's story. What began as a quiet mystery in the heart of the wilderness had become something much greater, a ripple that reached far beyond her cabin, beyond the remote forests, beyond the confines of traditional science. Conservation efforts took on a new meaning. Where once animals were studied purely as instinct-driven beings, researchers now approached their work with fresh eyes. Studies on animal consciousness and emotional intelligence gained momentum, and policies on wildlife protection shifted. If creatures like Theo were capable of complex thought, then humanity had a deeper responsibility to them than ever before. Margaret often found herself at the center of these discussions, though she never sought the spotlight. She was content knowing that the world was changing, that the old ways of thinking were giving way to something new. She watched as sanctuaries began to rethink their treatment of rescued animals, as scientists debated ethics not just in conservation, but in human-animal relationships as a whole. And yet, despite all the progress, one question remained unanswered. Why Theo? Why had he been different? Margaret never found a definitive answer. Perhaps Theo had always been special, a rare anomaly among his kind. Or perhaps all creatures held within them the potential for something greater, only waiting for the right circumstances to reveal it. She often thought of him, especially on quiet evenings when the fire flickered low and the wind whispered through the trees. She wondered where he was, whether he had found his place among the others, whether he ever thought of her. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret walked to the edge of the forest, she felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. There, just beyond the tree line, stood a massive silhouette. Even from a distance, she recognized him. Theo. Older now, larger, his presence more commanding than ever. But his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, had not changed. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. No words, no sounds, just understanding. Then, just as quietly as he had come, Theo turned and disappeared back into the wilderness. Margaret smiled. She had spent a lifetime trying to understand nature, to define it in the language of science. But in the end, Theo had taught her the most important lesson of all. Some things were not meant to be explained. Some things were simply meant to be felt. And perhaps that was the greatest truth of all.